Hey there, welcome to another Path of Exile guide, this time with a Vaal Ground Slam Chieftain. As usual, I'm rating the build on 5 different categories: defense, mapping and clearing speed, bossing and single target damage, cost and viability as a league starter. In Ultimatum League, Vaal Ground Slam received some huge buffs with the skill now being exerted by Warcries. It deals a lot more base damage and we're able to use it twice as often. Basically, the skill went from a decent one to absolute top tier in a single patch without requiring any extra fancy gear or mandatory uniques. Defense wise, this big boy is a pretty damn tough nut to crack. We're running around with 6 almost permanent endurance charges, 6k plus HP, stun immunity, fortify, a metric ton of life regen and life leech, immortal call with max duration and about a 50% uptime, decent chance to block and a metric ton of armor. Now, I feel like I need to stress out that the ultimatum mechanic is at the moment quite overtuned when it comes to the amount of damage it dishes out. You still won't be able to face tank waves just because you have several layers of defense. The strategy in this league for pretty much all the builds that are not abusing some energy shield restoration mechanics is to attack once or twice, then immediately move and keep running circles in that arena. I know it sucks, but a build can't fix a shitty design for a league mechanic. However, we're definitely not sacrificing damage or clearing speed to achieve that level of tankiness. The regular ground slam hits for almost half a screen with a Vaal counterpart going twice as big, and you'll never need to hit more than once to clear almost any monster pack. One tap and move on to the next bunch of mobs. Add Infernal Cry into the mix, which is basically twice as strong as the old Explodey chest, and you've got a massive clearing beast. As for bosses, the approach is a bit more tactical. You cast your Warcries and get the exerted stacks before actually engaging your target. Then you unload a couple of massive hits, ideally lined up with your damaged Flasks. Repeat as needed. This build has been my league starter in Ultimatum, and by day 3 or 4 I was comfortably running red tier maps and clearing stage 8 ultimatums. I've also killed the first few Conquerors and Awakening 5 Cirrus in those first days, and all that was easily done at the time on a budget of around 170-180 Chaos Orbs. Now obviously your millage may vary, but it should be quite easy to get the ball rolling. You can buy a corrupted 6-link pure armor base and recolor it with your crafting bench, and a random high physical DPS stuff which you can 5-link yourself. Everything else is just gravy. As for the cost, well, in my previous guides I thought it was quite obvious that prices will vary and an item can get literally 100 times more expensive from one day to another, with nobody foreseeing that. That is how the economy works in a player-driven market. So, to be clear, what you see here is a cost estimation at the time of recording to the best of my abilities and by no means a guarantee. Now, you can mitigate that to some extent by dropping by my stream on Twitch at twitch.tv/navandis. While it might sound like a shameless plug, the reality is that people watching me play live, putting together each build before it becomes a guide, get to buy most of its items for cheaper before the demand for them increases. They also see exactly how a build plays in various scenarios, how it levels up and the gearing choices I make as I go. And of course, I answer any questions on how the build works or any other Path of Exile topic. So with that slightly longer intro out of the way, let's dive into the guide proper. As usual, the guide is divided into 7 main sections: build overview, passive tree and leveling, ascendancy, pantheon, gems and links, gear, flasks and jewels, and finally pros and cons. That being said, let's start with a build overview. The build's main skill, Ground Slam, is a heavy hitting attack that smashes the ground and creates a sort of wave of spiky rocks which hits all enemies in a cone shaped area in front of you. By socketing to rapid expansion unique jewels in the passive tree, Ground Slam's area of effect pretty much doubles, becoming a semi-circle with a 180 degrees arc. A very important thing to note is that Ground Slam gains a massive damage bonus the closer you are to your target. Overkill when mapping in against trash mobs, but standing right on top of a boss will net you a huge damage boost. More dangerous, but hey, high risk, high reward. It also has a very high base chance to stun enemies, which increases with the amount of damage you deal on each hit. While by default the skill deals pure physical damage, we convert all of it into fire, as elemental damage is much easier to scale and gear up for. Now the title says Vaal Ground Slam, so let's clarify what that is about. Vaal gems are a special type of gem which provide not one but 2 abilities when you socket them into your gear. In this case, the Vaal Ground Slam gem gives you the regular Ground Slam ability, but also Vaal Ground Slam. 2 different skills housed on the same gem, and you can see both on my hotbar. On my right click I have the regular Ground Slam, and that will be the skill you'll be using 90% of the time. On the middle mouse button you can see Vaal Ground Slam, and using it requires a resource called souls. You gain those by killing enemies or hitting rare or unique monsters such as bosses. It can store up to 4 full charges, meaning once you've gathered enough souls, you can use Vaal Ground Slam back to back 4 times in a row. Its area of effect is 2 times larger than the regular Ground Slam, hitting in a 360-degree zone around you, and it has a 100% chance to stun enemies. And yes, that includes bosses, making it an insanely powerful tool when timed right, as it can interrupt some of the deadliest boss moves out there. Stunning Cirrus or some of the toughest bosses in Maven's Crucible can completely turn the tide in those fights. The same goes for encounters like Ultimatum. Stunning the entire arena will allow you to reposition or stack up your Warcries without risking a quick death. And speaking of Warcries, these are an incredibly important part of the build, and the better you learn how to juggle them, the more powerful your character will be. In total, the build uses 4 different Warcries, 3 offensive, Intimidating, Seismic and Infernal, plus a defensive one, Enduring Cry. Warcries are a special type of ability that can provide a buff for yourself based on the number of enemies around you and their rarity, a debuff on enemies, or both. They can also have a secondary effect called Exertion, which empowers the next couple of attacks in a certain way. Let's take for example Intimidating Cry. Its buff causes you to overwhelm affected target's physical defense, which we don't really care about since we're only dealing fire damage. It also applies a debuff on enemies, causing them to be intimidated, increasing all the damage they take from attacks, and Intimidating Cry also exerts your next 3 melee attacks, having them deal double damage. Now you can probably already see how important this single ability is, doubling the damage of an already insanely strong skill like Ground Slam or Vaal Ground Slam, because in Ultimatum, Vaal Ground Slam was buffed so it can be exerted as well. I'll go over the effects of each Warcry in the gem section, but for now I'll just mention that using them against trash mobs and most magic or rare monsters is generally overkill. The higher base damage you have, the less often you'll need to use Warcries to exert your attacks when mapping. Realistically, with good gear, Warcries will be a tool used to boost your damage almost exclusively in boss fights. All that being said, the build is definitely deceptively simple to play, but can be somewhat harder to master. Managing exerted attacks, lining them up with strong damage flasks, and using them at the right moment can trivialize a lot of boss fights. On the other hand, spamming the Warcries all willy-nilly or blowing your Vaal Ground Slam charges without being exerted can also lead to very poor performance. As with most things in Path of Exile, practice makes perfect. With the build overview out of the way, let's talk a bit about the passive tree and leveling. You start off as a Marauder, and even though you get Ground Slam at level 1, I actually recommend leveling up using Smite, linked with Ancestral Call instead. Add an Ancestral Protector totem when fighting bosses and you'll cruise through the first few acts. Warcries should also be used early on, as even without taking all the passives, they'll still provide massive damage bonuses and healing. Even if you use them strictly in boss fights, they're still worth socketing as soon as possible. You'll also find a couple of gem setups you should use while leveling in the Path of Building Guide aid. Also, keep in mind you don't need a staff in the first few acts, and you can use whatever weapons provide you the highest tooltip DPS for your leveling skill. I actually dual wielded the best physical damage weapons I could get up to about Act 5 or so. Speaking of Act 5, that's when you'll get your first rapid expansion jewel as a reward from the quest Death to Purity, and then's a good time to switch to Ground Slam and a two-handed weapon, ideally a staff. You should also look into obtaining a Vaal Ground Slam gem if possible. They're a pretty common drop in Vaal side areas, access to the red portals you sometimes find randomly in any region. You can also use a Vaal Orb on a regular Ground Slam gem, as that has a chance to upgrade it into Vaal Ground Slam. As for the passive tree, DPS wise we're mostly looking at grabbing stuff that boosts elemental damage, critical strike chance and multiplier, Warcry nodes and stuff related passives. Accuracy is also quite important, and a bit of attack speed will make the whole gameplay much smoother. Staffs are a great weapon type for this build, providing a good balance between raw damage and attack speed, as well as solid critical strike chance base. Staff specific nodes are also found very close to the starting points, and you can see we end up with a very compact passive tree, reducing the number of points wasted on traveling. On top of that, we get quite a bit of free block chance, and it's never a bad thing to get some extra defense. Speaking of blocking, I decided to take the Glancing Blows Keystone, even if on paper it's detrimental to raw defensiveness. In practice, it helps prevent big spikes of damage and smoothens the curve of incoming damage. This in turn gives you a better chance to react and replenish your health. In addition, it also helps gain power charges much more reliably through the Whirling Barrier passive. On the topic of keystones, we also take Unwavering Stance for stun immunity. We trade some non-existent chance to evade for it, so I'd say it's a pretty good deal. Next to this keystone there's Magmatic Strikes and its preceding small passive, and together these two will convert 40% of your physical damage into fire, and we combine them with Namahu's Flame Advanced node as well as a similar mod on a pair of gloves to end up with Ground Slam dealing 100% pure fire damage. Warcries are a big component of this build, so it's natural we invest some points into reducing their cooldown and increasing their speed. In addition, by taking Admonisher and Escalation passives, every time you Warcry you also restore 10% of your total HP and remove an ailment such as Ignite or Shock or Poison. That will definitely help with your overall survivability, which will further boost by picking up a metric ton of life, 2 extra endurance charges, lots of armor, life regen and block chance. Finally, I also opted to go without Cluster Jewels. There's a huge number of very strong passives on this side of the tree and we never need to travel far to get significant bonuses. We also already have multiple ways of scaling our damage, so in the end clusters would just be redundant. Well, a redundancy that would also cost a lot of currency to end up more or less in the same place we do with regular passive tree nodes. As for the Bandits, the choice for this build is simple. Help Alira and get the critical strike chance multiplier or resistances and mana regen bonuses. This will make leveling up much easier but also help with endgame gearing and sustain. Okay, so that's about it for the passive tree and leveling. Now let's go into the finer details, starting with the Ascendancy. For me, the clear top choice for this build is the Chieftain. It combines really strong defensive tools with excellent damage passives, both for single target damage and mass clearing. It also helps convert Ground Slam's damage into fire, which makes it much easier to scale our DPS. After completing your first labyrinth, grab Namahu's Flame Advance. It provides the physical to fire conversion I was talking about earlier, but also triggers a periodic buff which grants 100% physical damage as extra fire for 4 seconds. Now, if you check the build's damage in PoB, those numbers are without this buff, as its effect is not permanent. However, during those 4 seconds, your damage is literally doubled, and lining it up with exerted Vaal Ground Slams and Flasks can trivialize a lot of boss fights. Now, I'm not saying you should be watching this buff like a hawk, but if you feel like your damage is lackluster, you can double it by simply working on timing your strongest hits accordingly. With a bit of practice, you can even unload all 4 Vaal Ground Slam charges during those 4 seconds, which will hugely increase your damage output. The points from Crew Labyrinth go into Valako's Storm's Embrace. You get 1 extra endurance charge, bringing the total to 6 after taking the ones from the passive tree, and regenerate 0.5% life per second per endurance charge, so 3% in total. It will also generate 1 endurance charge every second if you've used the Warcry in the past 4 seconds, and this effect should be up almost permanently with this build. On top of that, if you've lost or consumed an endurance charge in the past 8 seconds, you'll gain a really strong damage buff. This will also be permanent as you're constantly using endurance charges with Immortal Call, but I'll go over this in the gems section. Now, I keep talking about endurance charges, so I guess I should explain what the hell are those anyway. So, these are a special kind of stacking buff, with each charge giving you physical damage reduction as well as elemental resistances. Every time you gain a new charge, the duration of the entire stack is reset, so in practice you'll run around with maximum charges almost all the time. Third Ascendancy passive is Ramako-san's Light for the very straightforward bonus of 15 fire resistance penetration. This might not seem like a big deal, but penetration has a huge impact against targets with high resistances, aka bosses. Finally, after completing the last lab, take Hinekora Death's Fury. Hitting rare enemies or bosses will cover them in ash, increasing the fire damage they take by a large amount and reducing their movement speed. On top of that, you get fire damage leached as life, a stat which is not exactly easy to come by on gear and always good to have as a decent survivability boost. With the Ascendancy out of the way, we can take a quick look at the Pantheon choices. Generally speaking, Pantheon choices are situational and there isn't a best pair that will outperform all others in any scenario. However, there are certain options that complement specific builds quite well in a wide range of situations. For this particular case, here are my recommendations. For the Major God, Soul of Arakali. It offers great defensive bonuses against damage over time, and that is still one of the few remaining weaknesses for the build. On top of that, it reduces Shock's duration and effectiveness, which is one of the most dangerous ailments out there. Any additional way to shave off extra damage you receive is more than welcome. As for the Minor God, Soul of Shakari is a good option if you haven't invested much in your chaos resistance. While it no longer provides poison immunity, it does help reduce its duration and overall damage quite a bit. Having covered the Pantheon choices, we can now focus on one of the most important aspects of any build, gems and links. Before I begin, I just need to remind you there are awakened versions for a few of the gems used in this build. Awakened gems are a stronger variant of their base, but at the same time much more expensive. Needless to say, if you can afford them or get a lucky drop, just replace the base gem with the awakened version. With that out of the way, as usual, I'll start off with the main skill Ground Slam and its supports. Now obviously the top priority is to get a Vaal Ground Slam gem, and I explained why in the build overview section, so check that out if you skipped it. In order of their importance, the support gems are elemental damage with attacks, pulverize, inspiration, fortify and melee physical damage. Otherwise put, if you only have a 5 link item, drop melee physical damage until you get a 6 link. Inspiration is a pretty interesting support gem. First, it significantly lowers the mana cost of your slam, which is actually more important than it seems. With a really low mana cost for a main skill, you're able to reserve more mana with auras, in turn increasing your DPS by a large margin. Then as you spend mana with Ground Slam, you'll gain inspiration charges which increase your crit chance and elemental damage. Obviously excellent for this build. When it comes to Fortify, it's not the best DPS support out there, but it grants you the aptly named Fortify buff, which will have you take 20% less damage from hits. Finally, if you really want to boost your single target damage, get a white socket on your body armor and swap melee physical damage with concentrated effect in boss fights. Now, since we are using a two-handed weapon, there's room for another 6-link setup, and that will revolve around the build's Swiss Army knife, Infernal Cry. There are two important but separate components of this ability. First, mobs affected by Infernal Cry, aka mobs that were nearby when you cast it, will explode on death, dealing fire damage in an area around them. On top of that, Infernal Cry exerts your next 7 Ground Slam attacks and will have them trigger a secondary attack called Combust, which is yet another fiery explosion. This means you can use Infernal Cry, move to a different pack of mobs a few screens away, hit them with Ground Slam, and they will be hit by Combust as well. The catch is, support gems linked with Infernal Cry will affect Combust as well, even if it's being triggered by Ground Slam. So why is this important? Well, there are a shitload of things you can do with an automatic attack that is linked in a separate setup than your main skill. In this case, we add Custom Critical Strike linked with Assassin's Mark, Wave of Conviction, Culling Strike and Combustion support. So when Combust deals a critical strike, it will cast either Assassin's Mark Curse or Wave of Conviction. Assassin's Mark increases your crit strike chance and multiplier against the affected target and provides a power charge when you kill it. Power charges equal even more crit chance. Wave of Conviction applies an exposure debuff, lowering the fire resistance of any enemy it hits. Both this spell and Combust will kill any enemy at or below 10% thanks to Culling Strike support, and that applies to bosses as well. Combustion support increases fire damage dealt by Infernal Cry's Corpse Explosion, and Combust secondary attack gives them a high chance to ignite and lowers the fire resistance of enemies ignited this way. Now, putting it all together, you use Infernal Cry and your next 7 Ground Slams trigger the Combust ability, which in turn triggers Wave of Conviction and Assassin's Mark, which in turn do a lot of nasty shit of their own, including cutting down Cirrus like an old dead tree. And all this by using your main skill as usual and pressing another button every 7 attacks. You gotta love Path of Exile. But wait, there's more. We have 3 additional war cries: Seismic, Intimidating and Enduring. Seismic and Intimidating are pure damage war cries. Now, you can read on the gems exactly what each of them does, but I'll just say, if you use them, you deal more damage. If you don't use them, your DPS will kinda suck. It won't really matter much against trash mobs, although I totally recommend them in ultimatums, but they will make a world of difference in boss fights. As for Enduring Cry, this is your panic button. It will heal you for about half of your HP, it will remove an ailment thanks to the Admonisher passive, and it will generate endurance charges. Get in the habit of using it as soon as you see your HP drop, and it will save your ass more times than you can count. All 3 war cries are linked to Second Wind, allowing you to use them an additional time before they go on cooldown, and it will also reduce the cooldown itself. Up next is a really simple aura setup: Herald of Ash and Herald of Purity, Precision for accuracy and crit chance, and Blood and Sand always kept in Blood stance. Finally, there's the mobility and utility setup: Dash and Immortal Call linked with Second Wind and increased duration. Dash is obviously the skill you'll use to get around, as well as dodge boss hits or other combat mechanics, and Second Wind gives it an additional charge so you can double dash if needed. Immortal Call provides a massive physical and elemental damage taken reduction buff, consuming up to 5 endurance charges to increase its duration. Now, the build has a million ways of generating endurance charges, such as Enduring Cry, Smashing Strikes passives, or Valako's Storm's Embrace Ascendancy node. These should be more than enough to both fuel Immortal Call and immediately get back to running around with 6 endurance charges. The way I use Immortal Call is to bind it to my left mouse button, replacing the default move action. As I keep the button pressed, it will move my character as usual, but also cast Immortal Call on cooldown. Since this is an instant cast skill, it won't interrupt movement at any point. When you combine that with the Dynamo passive, you also get a free way of constantly refilling your mana without using a mana flask or mana leech. With the gems out of the way, it's time to take a look at the recommended gear for this build. In this section, for each gear slot, I will outline 3 tiers: basic, mid-tier and best in slot. Generally speaking, prices increase significantly with each tier, but so do the benefits that the items bring. The Notes tab in the Path of Building guide contains trade links to help you find and buy the necessary gear. You can tweak the filters according to your budget and character at that time. Your main goal is to cap your elemental resistances and get as much life as possible. The rest of the affixes should be a mix of chaos resistance and damage ones, mostly in the form of physical, fire, attack speed and crit mods. Starting from the top, a good basic tier helmet has 60 plus elemental resistances, 80 plus max life, some chaos resistance or accuracy, ideally on an armor base. A good mid-tier one is the often overlooked Date Bellow. It provides a decent amount of physical and melee damage, as well as extra attack and movement speed if you've Warcried recently. A more defensive alternative is the pretty common Crown of the Inward Eye, a well rolled one netting you about 350 total life, a metric ton of armor and even some DPS. Finally, for best in slot, you've got the high risk, high reward Abysses. It comes with a massive flat physical damage bonus as well as crit multiplier, 2 mods which aren't normally found on this gear slot. A huge amount of armor as well as 20 plus all attributes further increase the value of this item. However, all these come at a cost: 40 to 50% increased physical damage taken. For most builds, this would be fatal, but with 6 endurance charges and a huge amount of armor, you'll actually still be incredibly tanky and won't really feel this penalty. However, definitely look for ones with at most 42 to 43 increased damage taken. Going higher than that will start hurting. Moving on to your weapon, you'll be using a two-handed staff, and on a basic one you're looking for 400 plus physical DPS along with some crit strike chance or crit multiplier. If the staff has some flat fire damage on it, that will help as well, but don't go out of your way for mods like that. For mid-tier, you can upgrade to either of these two uniques, Hegemony's Era or the Enmity Divine. Both have really good physical damage rolls and excellent crit chance, as well as extra chance to block. Hegemonies will also help with generating power charges, which in turn will further increase your global crit chance. Meanwhile, the Enmity Divine has a really interesting baked-in ability. You'll be able to summon a permanent and invincible Heartbringer minion, which will periodically cast a buff that greatly boosts your damage, attack speed and movement speed. Now, the blue boy is actually pretty smart and won't waste this buff when you're fighting trash mobs, but only when a rare monster or a boss is nearby. You can basically consider this minion an aura. You summon it and let it do its thing without caring why or how or when. Finally, for best in slot, you should aim for 500 plus physical DPS, crit strike chance and crit multiplier, and maybe some attack speed to make the gameplay feel smoother. Warlord or Elder Influence staffs can also roll some really strong prefixes such as gain percentage physical damage as extra fire damage, increased damage per 10 strength, culling strike, attacks penetrate fire resistance, etc. Ideally, all this should be on a judgment staff base for the spell block implicit. Up next is the body armor, and this is mostly a defensive slot. At basic tier, you need at least 5 links, 70 plus life and 70 plus elemental resistances. Some extra chaos resistance or dexterity would also be a great bonus. For mid tier, you're looking for pretty much the same affixes but with 6 links and higher numeric values. It should ideally be on a pure, non-hybrid armor based. If there's an empty prefix, then you can craft the hybrid mode, percentage increase maximum life, percentage increase maximum mana, or add some extra chance to block using your hideout's crafting bench. Finally, for best in slot, an ideal one should have 90 plus life, close to 1k armor, and the hunter or elder specific suffix attacks have plus critical strike chance. While that 1% or so crit might seem like a tiny number, in reality it has a huge impact. That's actually base crit chance, which is added to your weapon's crit chance, and the resulting value gets multiplied by all those percentage increased critical strike chance passives and affixes on your other gear pieces. Armors with that mode will always be crafted, so they're really expensive early in the league, but steadily drop in price as you approach mid-league. This is why initially you should look for one without any resistance or very low rolls, and afterwards upgrade as the prices go down. Moving on to gloves, on basic ones look for 60 plus life and elemental resistances along with some flat physical damage. If you can, get some accuracy or dexterity as well to cap your chance to hit and have enough dex to level up your green gems. On mid-tier ones you're aiming for pretty much the same stats, but with the mod percentage of your physical damage converted to fire damage, instead of accuracy or dex. This combined with your Ascendancy and magmatic strikes on the passive tree will convert 100% of your damage into fire. Finally, for best in slot, a good lineup is 60 plus life, flat physical and fire damage, physical converted to fire, 1 resistance mod and an open suffix. This will allow you to add more resistances if needed, or a hybrid chaos plus elemental resistance using your hideout crafting bench. Alternatively, you could even craft the hybrid mod, percentage increased global crit strike chance plus percentage increased elemental damage if you've dealt a critical strike recently. For boots, an excellent pair of basic ones are the unique Red Blade Tramplers. Movement speed, some life, a bit of resistance and a solid amount of armor. But the real selling point is the added flat physical damage, an affix that is not normally found on boots. Mid-tier ones should have at least 25% movement speed, 70 plus life and resistances, maybe with some dex if you haven't gotten enough for your green gems yet. And as best in slot, you're looking for more or less the same mods but better rolls, so 30% movement speed, 90 plus life, 90 plus total resistances. If some of that is chaos res, it's even better. Now if you can afford it, then a warlord influence pair of boots with gain percentage of physical damage as extra fire damage prefix is a really solid damage increase, but don't expect that to be cheap at any point. Up next is your belt slot, and for basic and mid tier, it should have about 90 plus life, 70 plus elemental resistances, elemental damage with attack skills, all on a rustic sash base for the physical damage implicit. For best in slot, replace the base with a Stygian Vice for the extra jewel socket. Also, if your elemental resistances are already capped, then look for some chaos resistance instead, as well as some flask related mods. The Amulet is a versatile slot in this build, and it should be used to squeeze out as much damage as possible while having just enough resistances to be capped. On basic amulets, look for flat added physical damage, a good amount of life and some elemental resistances. Ideally on a turquoise or Sighting Brace, so you can squeeze out some extra dex and int from the implicit. You'll need a bit of both, and this is the best place you can get those attributes. Mid-tier ones have more or less similar affixes, but add a crit multiplier mod, flat fire damage or increased damage with elemental attacks. Finally, for best in slot, a solid lineup looks like 50 plus life, gain percentage of physical damage as extra fire damage, and any combination of flat physical or fire damage, critical strike multiplier, increased global critical strike chance or increased fire damage. Any secondary mods such as dex, int, accuracy, resistances are always more than welcome. Amulets can also be anointed using oils dropped from blight encounters to add a notable passive to them without changing the item in any other way. For this particular build, the best DPS option is Lava Lash for some additional fire resistance penetration and increased fire damage. Serpent Stance is a cheap and decent alternative for a combination of offense and defense. For pure defense, something like Cruel Preparation is a top choice, but that should be necessary only if you're playing hardcore. With rings, it's the same story as with the amulet. Squeeze out as much DPS as possible while using just enough affixes for capping your resistances. On basic ones, look for 40 plus maximum life, just enough resistances to be capped, along with some flat physical damage and some dex or int. Mid-tier ones should have pretty much the same affixes, just higher numeric values, as well as some critical strike chance or some form of fire damage, either flat or percentage increased. Finally, for best in slot, you can go with a rare ring, having a bit more damage than the mid-tier one, and the Circle of Anguish unique. This ring can roll Herald of Ash related mods, and you're looking for the pair Herald of Ash has increased buff effect and increased fire damage while affected by Herald of Ash. On top of that, this ring can have up to 3 implicit mods, most of them garbage, but you can still find a few useful ones like resistances, attributes, or even fire damage. Up next are jewels, and you'll have 3 sockets on the passive tree, and ideally an extra one on your Stygian Vice belt for an abyssal jewel. 2 sockets on the tree will be taken by rapid expansion uniques. These increase the angle of ground slam, allowing you to cover a much larger area each time you hit. You get 1 such jewel as a quest reward in Act 5, and you can buy the second one from other players or get it as a drop. This is a really common and generally cheap unique jewel, which means you can try to corrupt a couple of them for some useful implicits. The best outcome is the mode Corrupted Blood cannot be inflicted on you, followed by You cannot be hindered, especially for Ultimatum. For the leftover socket, you can go with a rare jewel, and you're looking for maximum or flat life, chance to gain onslaught on kill, flat physical or fire damage, critical strike chance and multiplier, attack speed or increased fire damage. The damage mods can come in a variety of formats, with staffs while wielding a two-handed weapon with fire skills, etc. I can't list them all here, but you can find trade links in the notes tab of the Path of Building guide. Even better, once you can afford it, get a Watcher's Eye unique jewel with a mod plus critical strike multiplier while affected by precision. Moving on to flasks, these are quite an important component of this build and they will greatly boost your overall damage. First you need a Seething Divine Life Flask of Staunching. Instant healing is a real lifesaver and bleeding removal is absolutely mandatory while mapping. Then, since this is a crit build, a Chemist's Diamond Flask is a must-have. Lucky crit chance means the game rolls twice to determine if a hit crits, then applies the best result. In practice, this means you get a much higher effective crit chance while the flask effect is active, so make sure you use it constantly. The suffix should be of heat for chill and freeze immunity. Third one is Lion's Roar Unique Flask. It grants you a huge amount of physical damage, especially when lining it up with exerted attacks and the Diamond Flask. Fourth flask is a Chemist Quicksilver Flask of Adrenaline. Movement speed directly affects your efficiency and map clearing potential, as well as allowing you to move out of harmful spots faster. And for the last one, there's a bit of flexibility. You can go with a Surgeon Silver Flask for a decent damage boost and some life regen, or a more defensive approach using a Quartz or Amethyst Flask. If you didn't yet pick up the Dynamo passive, then an Enduring Eternal Mana Flask will take care of all your mana issues. In either case, the suffix has to be of warding for curse immunity. Curses are encountered really often while mapping and they can be crippling, greatly reducing your defenses or damage output. Now, to wrap up the gearing section, here are some excellent leveling uniques which will help you easily progress through the campaign. With the gearing out of the way, it is time to take a final look at the pros and cons of the build so you can better understand if it's what you're looking for. Starting off with the pros, very tanky and resilient, between endurance charges, block chance, huge amounts of armor, life regen, enduring cry, immortal call, you'll be really hard to kill. Really satisfying map clearing, your ground slams and explosions cover the entire screen, so the build is quite efficient at quickly killing large packs of mobs. Really fun build. I know this is an often overlooked aspect in Path of Exile, but it's always great to play a build that just feels right. Between war crying and smashing all mobs to pieces with giant slams, you'll feel like a sort of mythological fiery titan. Efficiency scales with player skill. Getting more familiar with the build and its playstyle is immediately rewarded with overall better performance. Each gear upgrade will be a significant buff, generally proportional with the investment. As such, it has a very high performance ceiling and the build is great for a long-term project. It will take a long time to reach a point where you feel you're no longer progressing. As for the cons, it is still a melee build. While Ground Slam does have a generous range, you'll be in the thick of things most of the time, more vulnerable than a pure ranged character. You cannot run elemental reflect maps, still this is a less of a problem nowadays since there's a Sextant mod which grants immunity to reflected damage. You need to press quite a few buttons. While the build itself is not complicated to play, you do have to use a number of buff skills and that can take a while to get used to.
Learn anything new, Exile?
If you did, then you'll probably be happy to hear there are more videos coming up in the near future with more exciting builds to try. Make sure not to miss them by subscribing to the channel so you get notified when that happens. And while you're at it, why not like this video as well or drop a comment down below to let me know your thoughts. Thank you all for watching and see you next time.